Hello and welcome to How to Be a Better DM, a part of Session Zero Studios. My name is Tanner Wayland, and I'm going to help you learn how to have a great time playing and directing D&D as a DM, while also having fun with it, improving week after week. And speaking of improvement, that's a key part of today's topic. So recently, we actually just barely put out the podcast episode, but we talked with Dan Wells. He's an author, but also is a very experienced professional dungeon master. And during that recording, I remember we were talking with him, and he mentioned how he's not the best at everything, but he's really good at telling a story. And he mentioned focusing on strengths. And since then, I've just been thinking about it a lot because it's something I've also personally been thinking about in my own life, at work and in other situations. I've just been thinking about it gets so easy to focus on all the things you could do better at. But how often do you focus on what you're already pretty good at? Like recently, my parents were like, "Oh, hey," I was talking to them about some, concerns in my job and also just like the thoughts in general. And they turned me on to this quiz kind of thing. You've probably heard of a lot of those like personality quizzes out there. This is adjacent to that. It's not like the 16 personalities or anything, which I've done, and those are interesting. But this was called the Clifton 34 Strengths test. And it really focused in on, hey, to do this test, it took a second, but once it did, it categorized by what you're strongest in and what you're least strong at. And it was a reframing for me, realizing I'm like, you know what? I personally, and I'm sure a lot of you do better at focusing on your strengths than I do, but me, I focus a lot on my weaknesses, trying to make up for those. But reframing it and being like, hey, we each have strengths. And that's especially true as a DM. It makes you feel more jazzed. It gives you a different way to approach your journey of how to be a better DM, right? Now, some classic DM strengths that all of us look at in the podcasts around us or the live plays, uh, they can do a lot of voices. Matt Mercer's great at this. A lot of people can do really good improv. Like they make a very funny scene just because they've studied improv, honestly. Some are just very eloquent with their descriptions. Others are just super creative with world building. Like it's super novel and they bring something fresh to the table every time. Some, they create such amazing like sets and minis and everything like that. They paint it perfectly, right? All these are things that are commonly, if you're looking on Instagram, if you're listening to podcasts, if you're watching actual plays on YouTube or Twitch, these are the things that you'll be drawn to immediately and be like, oh man, that person's so good at that. And I think that those are absolutely things to aspire to. And you may have a strength in those things. Before we dive into how to recognize your own strengths and stuff, I also want to say that there's a lot of different types of strengths. Those more obvious ones, the ones that are a little bit more showy, the ones that seem more obvious, those are great. But there's also a whole set of strengths that it might be hard for you to realize or to recognize. Like maybe you could be a DM whose strength is your ability to include every player in the action and in the story, right? Because sometimes, it gets very easy to focus on certain specific players who are, like putting out their best. Maybe they're a little bit more easy to bounce off of. But some DMs do really well, naturally including the person who's a little bit quieter, a little bit more reserved. That's a strength. Also, cooperative storytelling. I think that when we're talking about voices or setting descriptions or world building, this is all very DM focused, where it's like, oh, the DM is some game making god who's just so good at doing it. But the strength of kind of bringing something to the table, seeing what your players are bringing to the table, and then making that into cooperative storytelling, not everyone has that. When we talk a lot about, oh, not railroading, but actually playing off of your players, that's what that is. And it's a strength that some people are much better at doing. And on the other hand, like hand in hand with that is just flexibility. Some DMs do really well at, hey, they plan a lot, but then they're also comfortable just throwing a bunch of those plans out to do what tells a great story and what is the most fun for players. They're just flexible. Others are great at communicating expectations early and often so that players don't, so that there doesn't ever need to be a conflict in expectations between the DM and the players. Some are also great at responding and receiving constructive criticism. It's not fun, but it is a strength to not get mad at your players when they're like, hey, could we have more of this? Or to when you're watching actual plays or listening to this podcast, the ability to see where you could improve and to accept that positively, that's a strength in and of itself. And then, of course, as a final strength, the ability to meet on a regular basis. That's, you might think, oh, how's that strength? If anyone has tried to keep a long time game going, you know that the DMs who are able to like, hey, no, yeah, we can just keep meeting every other week or once a month for like years and years. That's a rare talent. And it's one that a lot of us wish we had more of. But going away from talking about these specific strengths, let's talk about how you can actually recognize strengths in yourself because it's hard. You know how I was talking about that like strengths quiz that I took. Ironically, my like least strong strength was called maximizer, which is like the ability to recognize and maximize on your own strengths, which is hilarious. That it's like, oh, of my strengths, the ability to recognize and utilize my strengths is my least strong strength. That's a mouthful, and it's also just ironic as all get out. But it did show me, I was like, okay, I had to really learn about like, how do I recognize my own strengths? And I've been thinking a lot about this from a DM's perspective as well. And I think step one is asking. As you jump into DMing, you're going to be new to a lot of things. So try a lot of different like approaches, right? Try a lot of different approaches with role playing. Try it with combat encounters, with like world building, whatever it is. Once you've tried those and you played with players, they'll get a feel for what you're good at. And it's not bad to just ask them individually and be like, hey, how am I doing? And then prod deeper. Be like, hey, I'm trying to like, what do you think that I'm good at? That's a hard question to ask sometimes, right? Because it feels like you're fishing, but it's no, I'm trying to understand what you already enjoy the most about my style of DMing. Because I really want to lean into that rather than downplaying it. So asking the players in your sessions is, and I would do this individually rather than like all at once. Of course, you could do it all at once if you have that kind of group, and probably people could remind each other of things, and that'd probably be a big confidence booster. And if they don't have anything to say, don't take that to heart. Some people aren't super conscious of things like that. Do it with people you trust, who you know are very like, they're very observant, but they are a great resource for you to find out. Second, aside from asking people what you're good at, you can also ask yourself, like, what feels easy? What don't I stress about? And if it's, oh, I don't stress about coming up with a way to include a player's backstory, then obviously that kind of cooperative storytelling is a strength of yours. Because you're like, oh, I don't have to put all of this work into writing it in. I find ways to include flashbacks, to include NPCs just naturally. That's a great thing. It also shows that you're very cognizant of where your players' backstories are, which is awesome. Maybe something else for you that's easy is creating a bunch of, maybe it's not easy, but it just comes a lot easier to you than others, is creating a bunch of map environments and ambiance and minis and things like that. For some people that feels, oh my goodness, they could never do that. But if that's a strength of yours and you're like jazzed and it feels easy for you to jump into these projects, then that's a strength, and lean into that fully. Be like, okay, I'm grateful that I'm good at creating these things and that I don't let it get too much into my head about it. Like my brother's that kind of person where he is very crafty, but he's mostly crafty and good at crafts because he just jumps into it without overthinking. And he's gotten better over time. And that's an absolute strength of his. And he would probably, at this point, he knows it's a strength, but early on, he probably didn't realize that. And so asking yourself what's easy for you, whether it's descriptions, whether it's improv, whether it's including humor, whatever it is, lean into that and be like, okay, if it's easy, I'm probably pretty good at it. And of course, you can always ask and be like, hey, do you enjoy the humor that I throw in? Do you enjoy the descriptions? And just get that clarification. Also, uh, instead of asking your players, you can always just test things out, right? Something that you think might be a strength of yours, put a lot of work into it for this next session, right? Like a description of a new room in a dungeon. If you feel like you're pretty great with descriptions and descriptive language, go hard on this next room and just write as eloquently and beautifully and interesting as you can, but in the way you normally would, and just see if it gets a reaction. When you see that you're getting reactions for specific types of things, whether it's monsters that you've created or world building or certain NPC interactions, whatever it is, getting a reaction and players being like, wow, that was hilarious, or oh man, that was really good. Those are ways to tell that you're good at what you're doing, right? And also, if they're talking about it after the session, if you finish a session and they're like, oh man, that was so great, and then they list some things, think about what within that you contributed to and why they liked it so much, because that could tell you a lot about some of your strengths there. And then, of course, you can also just look at yourself and just try and be objective and be like, what does it feel like I do better than maybe some other DMs that I've seen? And that key thing here, never put other DMs down for being less good at something than you, but rather just appreciate that you are good at some things. It's always important to keep this very positive in general, because it's so easy to focus on, either your weaknesses or other DM's weaknesses. That's the opposite of what I want with this topic, because if you focus on your strengths and others are focusing on their strengths, then in the end, we'll have a lot of great DMs out there who have different flavors, who have different expertises. But either way, you don't want to focus a lot on weaknesses in general, but you can manage them, right? Because as much as you want to focus on these strengths and learn to develop them and realize them, you will have some weaknesses, and you'll want to not completely ignore those, right? Even though it can feel tedious, and even though if you're like me, it can feel like you can get really focused on those and get perfectionistic. But a way that you can tell maybe what a weakness of yours is kind of the opposite of the earlier questions. Like, what doesn't feel easy for you? What doesn't feel super fun? Or on the other hand, where does it feel like the flow of the game drags? And you could either ask players this, or you could just notice it yourself, right? Does combat feel like it drags? Then that could be a weakness. Does role playing feel like it's a drag? Then maybe you need to write out more specific blocks of dialogue for you to practice that, right? If you realize things that drag or that don't feel easy or don't elicit a spark from your players, then that's somewhere to be like, okay, maybe that's not my strength. And maybe I need to just make sure that I put time into that. But in the end, you're going to want to focus on your strengths, because remember, not everyone in the podcast, not Matthew Mercer, not Brendan Lee Mulligan or Dan Harmon or anyone like that, none of them are perfect. The reason why you like them is because they focus on their strengths and they maximize those to the extent, to the greatest extent they can. And then they also, luckily for them, they have teams that kind of help fill in for those weaknesses. And even if you don't necessarily have that, you can recognize those weaknesses and patch them up with techniques you find online, techniques you find on this podcast, and then spend most of your time focusing on those strengths. But one thing that I want to just remind you about in all of this is that you absolutely have strengths. And maybe, you know what, maybe a lot of your strengths aren't even D&D related, and that's fine. But there's probably some strengths that you could co-opt into making your D&D experience more rich, right? If you're great at cooking, You could make snacks every time, which I guarantee improves the ambiance and improves the friendliness and everything like that, right? If I do believe that there's gifts that all of us have that could be used in storytelling, which is the essence of DMing, or in interacting with players, which is the other part of it. But then there's other stuff that's just like, hey, at the heart of D&D is you're hanging out with friends. And you definitely have strengths that can make that kind of hanging out more enjoyable. So I really do hope that you take this to heart, that you, like I, realize it gets so easy to focus on the weaknesses. So let's not do that anymore. Let's manage those weaknesses, but mostly focus on what we can be good at. And I think that you'll notice as you do that, games start to be more fun. They start to feel more easy. They also it starts to feel like you have a real voice as a DM, right? Because you're not just trying to be like everyone else, you're trying to be like you to the best extent you can be. So hopefully you've gotten some good insight or some good ideas from this. But in the end, I hope that you have a really fun time planning your next session, learning about your strengths, and until next time, let's roll initiative.
Brought to you by Session Zero Studios. For more information, visit sessionzerostudios.com.